This is the Parents in Sport podcast. Amazing guests, honest conversations, topics that matter.
Welcome to season 5 of the Parents in Sport podcast. I am your host, Gordon MacLelland. I'm delighted to be joined today by founder and director at Sport and Beyond, sports parent and author, Catherine Baker. Catherine, thank you for joining us on the show.
My pleasure. I'm really pleased to be here with you, Gordon.
I'm excited by the wide range of topics, I guess, that we'll be talking about over the next 45 minutes or so. But obviously, I know quite a lot about you. But could you just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So sport has been integral throughout my life. As a youngster, I was part of a large family. We were left to our own devices for a lot, but by my parents, because we were the sort of 5 children in 6 years. So really a lot of my childhood involved being outside, running around, doing made-up games, but also then starting to do more formal sports. I was the sporty kid at school, so sport absolutely part of my childhood. Started off just with that enjoyment, that love of activity, love of running around, but then certainly became more, as I said, formal in terms of playing 2 particular sports to representative level, tennis and hockey. When I was 12, actually, it was suggested to me that I should choose between the two if I really wanted to make it, and I couldn't, because I loved hockey for the team environment, being with my friends and all that brought. And I loved tennis actually because of the kind of slightly adversarial nature, the having to depend on yourself, make your own decisions, etc. So luckily continued to play both to representative level, but not onto as a career. I did, though, get my first qualification as a tennis coach and did a lot of tennis coaching in my year off between school and university. Very much then went down the academic route. I was very fortunate to get sponsored by Magic Circle law firms, and one of the big global law firms sponsored me through law school, and I trained and qualified there. So Linklaters, it was called. Amazing professional grounding. And I spent 13 years as a corporate lawyer, but maintain my love of sport, maintain my sort of playing as a hobby then, really. Had a family, so that shift obviously in responsibility, time that you've got, and looking at sport then very differently, and also through that changed sort of into a second career where I very much focus on leadership and mindset. So that's what I do now, and I've had the privilege of working with many elite athletes, elite coaches, and sort of senior leaders across sectors. So that's a bit of a snapshot, and I'm sure we'll dive into some of that as we go through.
Yeah, amazing stuff. I think it's incredible when we've got so many different avenues to explore, I guess. And it is lovely hearing, people's love of sport when they were younger, and then obviously you have your own families, and then you do take them to sport if you've had an amazing experience or engaged positively with it. So you've got 3 children who I know have done pretty well with their sport, to be fair to them. So how's the sports parenting journey been for you?
Gosh, I mean, everything from joyous to heartbreaking, a real privilege, as my husband and I both enjoyed and have got a huge amount from sport. So it's a real privilege that our 3 sons have done the same. They've all been keen on playing sport, lots of different sports. They've all got huge amounts out from it. So, a real privilege. I think it's been a huge learning curve as well, being a sports parent, and I'm sure we'll touch on that. The way that I parented my boys in terms of their sport towards the sort of latter end of their childhood compared to the beginning was completely different. Hopefully better, but certainly completely different.
Yeah, I think you touch on a really good point there, and I think quite a lot of parents who we've spent time with will often say that, and I include myself in that. I look at how I behaved with my children in the early stages, and I'm already mortified, and they're still a lot younger than yours. I don't know what I was possibly thinking. I shared with somebody recently, I think I held my 6-year-old son accountable to the same standards as players that had coached at a higher level and got paid for. Because I just thought...
We've all done it. We've all done it, Gordon.
Yeah. I thought, well, that's clearly what it has to look like, and then you realize
that's clearly acceptable.
Yeah, but actually this isn't working at all. This isn't working for me. It's not working for them. And I think you do go on a journey as you go through, and nobody's ever tried to support sports parents. I mean, I think that's the challenge, because you all just try to, like with parenting in general, you just do your best based on your own experiences and what you've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why what you're doing is critical, and why I was really happy to appear on this podcast. As you say, there's a gap there in terms of educating parents. And parents are so important in the holistic view of whether it's a youngster, playing sport as a real athlete, wanting to do well, or whether just for fun and enjoyment, etc. So yeah, I think that missing piece is absolutely critical, and it's great you're filling it.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm just thinking about your own sort of sport, and you played. What were some of the things that you maybe took from that and your own experiences into those early stages of sports parenting, where you thought, oh, well, that's clearly what I should be doing, and then realized that maybe actually, no, that's probably not a great idea?
Yeah, I think one of them in particular is my competitive instinct, right? One of the reasons why did well in sport is because I am competitive. Not so much that I want to win, but I'm striving, and I want to continually do better and play better. And I'm disappointed if I haven't performed as well as I hoped I had. But you've got to box that away as a parent, though, haven't you? And I, a bit like you just alluded to there, probably struggled with that at the beginning. And I will share a story which really highlights this, and it puts me in a very bad light. But I think it's really important to share these stories. So, all three boys, as I said, played a number of sports, rugby in particular being one of them. And I remember when my eldest son, who must have been like under 8, under 9, it was starting to play competitive fixtures. It was a school fixture. And I was on the sideline next to one of my really good friends. And as this lad on the other side was running towards my son, I found myself shouting, get him down, get him. And it was just awful. And this friend looked at me as if, Catherine, what are you saying? And it was a stark realization that two things: not only was my thought process completely wrong, but my communication was completely wrong. And actually, I said to myself after that, I'm never going to say anything on the sideline other than well done, or, work hard. So anything I was going to say was only going to be encouraging. And I was absolutely mortified that I had come out with, asking my son to sort of attack an 8-year-old boy just because he was running at him with a ball. So I think boxing away your own competitive instinct and really thinking much more effortfully and intentionally about the messages that you're communicating to your child, whether it be when they're on the pitch, when quite frankly you shouldn't really as a parent be communicating any messages at all, really, or more importantly on the way to or on the way back from a particular game. And trust me, I've got many things wrong, but I think a good demonstration of how I've been on that journey to get better was our youngest son, who has now sort of turned professional in rugby. He's out on for a loan club. He was playing in a match on Saturday. He's been a bit injured, hadn't played for a few weekends. We hadn't met anyone from the loan club before, but we went to watch him on Saturday. And as he ran out, I said, enjoy yourself. And I would not have said that, 5-10 years ago. So I kind of metaphorically gave myself a pat on the back for getting it certainly better than I did before. But I think that's definitely, that competitive instinct. I think one of the things as well that I've learned, we all know the benefits of sport, don't we? We all know that sport teaches us so much about life, and it reveals so much about ourselves as well. And I think I'll share another example with my middle son where that was absolutely right. And again, I learned from this experience. So again, let's say under 9, under 10, local club rugby. He was very fortunately voted player of the year. We weren't expecting it. He suddenly had to go up and make a little speech. He was 9 or whatever. And there I was at the back trying to get his attention to kind of communicate to him what I thought he should say. Thank goodness he didn't catch my eye. And he stood up and said something 10 times better than I would have suggested that he said as a 9-year-old. Short, succinct, showed really good leadership, all about the team. And again, that was another lesson that it really does reveal character, and you have to let go.
Yeah, and I think the challenge for young people and working with a lot of them is, I think there's lots of elements of society which aren't helping them with some of those character traits at the moment. I think the impact of technology, social media, I guess in some ways, even some of our parenting, and that's not me quoting here, about parenting in this generation is actually maybe chipping away into some of those building blocks our young people need. And I think you're right. I think we're having to be a lot more explicit and intentional about talking about it with our young people and the benefits that sport can bring. Otherwise, it just gets lost in the outcome driven part of sport.
Absolutely. I mean, I could talk to you for a long time about focusing on the process and sort of, the outcomes will take care of itself. We might touch on that a bit later when we talk about my book. But I think just in terms of the young people and playing and enjoying and remembering why they're there, remembering the purpose behind turning up. They want to see their friends. They want to have a good run around. They want to, play British Bulldog or whatever. It doesn't have to be about the actual specific sport or about the outcome. And I think the more we remember that as parents, and the process bit is also about they're not just being developed in that particular sport. The whole time they're being developed as people, right? Those absolutely sit side by side. So whether it's tennis or whatever sport, basketball, skating, whatever it might be, you're not just developing the person in that sport, but you're developing them as a person, and that's critical.
Yeah, I think helping young people today understand why they're winning and why they're being successful is far more important, because it's going to stand them in such good stead that they can link any positive outcomes they achieve, actually, as you say, to those processes and the things that they go through. And they definitely need support in that. There's definitely, I feel, with young people, they're living in this world of, I guess, fake perfectionism, I guess the comparison piece, and actually getting them just to be comfortable with themselves and giving themselves the best chance of fulfilling their potential, because everybody's different, aren't they?
Absolutely. I think on the fake perfection bit, the message around hard work and effort, targeted, but you can't do, nothing happens without hard work and effort. And I think, to be fair, that is a message which is being reinforced in schools and generally in youth sport, but it's probably more needed. It's more of an acute need that message is reinforced at that level because of what they're seeing on social media and stuff. So I absolutely agree with that. I think the other point around, it's an interesting one, isn't it? So as an example, when the rugby rules changed and there's, a lot of mini age groups where they used to have like tournaments and winners, and then suddenly it was sort of everyone taking part and everyone got a medal and making sure the teams were mixed and everyone got an opportunity. That was an interesting thing for me to go through, because even though with my work hat on, I totally agree with that and understood the benefits and understood the rationale, particularly in a sport like rugby where you want to keep players in the game for as long as possible and players develop at different ages, etc. I would have my children going, it's going to be a bit frustrating today because there's no winners, or we're not going to have our best team. And I could understand it from their point of view. I could see why they were saying that. And I had to work really hard to help them, try and educate them on why it was important to go about it in that way. But, they were in the moment, they were young. They were never really going to have that full perspective and understanding that you do as an adult. So that was quite an interesting tension as they were growing up.
Yeah, and I think that lends itself to something else, and I speak a lot about this with parents, is we've got to stop trying to box children up on what we think they should be doing, because the reality there is some children are massively competitive and do want to win.
Yeah.
And some people have very different goals, and yet there can be out on media this, oh no, every child does it because it's fun, for example. Well, that's fine, but what does fun mean? And the research giving you 81 different definitions of fun, what may be fun for you, Catherine, may not be fun for me. And I always say to parents, it's a very individual thing with your child. You've got to understand why they're competing, what's motivating them, and the reasons that they're in, because only then can you work with them to support. You can't just do it on a general message that we see on media.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, Gordon, it's, as you say, everyone has their own motivation. It's about identifying that, but also as a parent, again, particularly with young children, making sure it's not you putting your own motivation on that. You'll have this a lot, I'm sure, in the work you do. We see it a lot, don't we, where parents have got to a certain level in a particular sport, perhaps didn't make it or whatever, and they're sort of living vicariously through their children. And, that can be okay for a while. And then at some point, you'll see the child will probably rebel. You'll see the children coming up, not with a smile on their face when they turn up to training on a wet, cold Sunday morning or whatever it is. So there is that stage where it's, really got to come from the child, and you've really got to try and understand what that motivation is. And I think often they don't know that, do they? We also expect quite a lot of young people. And actually, if you're 7, 8, 9, if you're asked to give your motivation, it's probably quite difficult to define that. And again, one of the conversations we had with our youngest son, who has worked really hard and done really well, but the first time he was ever in a position to get selected for something he really wanted to get selected for, he wasn't selected, he was rejected. He was, let's say, 14, and he was really disappointed. And I remember saying to him at the time, all the stuff around, these lows kind of power your highs, and trying to do all that talking around mindset and resilience. But equally, this is a real opportunity for you to work out what you want from rugby. Do you want to, is it just fun with your friends? Absolutely fine. In which case, it's probably not the end of the world if you haven't got selected. You'll just keep playing at the level you are. But if you're really frustrated and really annoyed, and it's really made you think, do you know what, I really want to see how far I can get, then you've had an opportunity to learn that because you haven't been selected. And then you think about what you need to do to give yourself the best chance next time round. So I think it's easy to imagine that children can identify and articulate their motivation, but sometimes it takes bit of maturity or a particular event to help them do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think certainly with the youngest, as you say, whenever you ask them that question, most parents will say because it's fun.
Yeah.
And as I say, the problem with that is that what does
that mean?
But what does it mean?
Yeah.
And the research, Amanda Vissek's research that I think has, when the children were asked to rank those sort of definitions of fun, I think winning was 48th and playing in a competition was 60th. And I'm very open with parents because I don't get that. It's a top 5 answer for me. I put my kids in sport. It was a top, I'm not going to lie that, but I've been institutionalized by sport and my own background. And again, I think that, it is going to be different for some children, because you spoken to a couple of the Lionesses' parents, and when they described their children, or when they were children back then, they reckon they were purely motivated by being in the best in the world and winning.
Yeah, I think it's really complex, isn't it? I totally get what you're saying about the whole thing about winning and losing is actually what that gives you, the toolkit you build around that. So competition, winning and losing, I think is still really important. We know that a lot of children are driven by that. I think what it tells us is there's probably no one sort of answer, no one journey. And I think it's probably no bad thing that we sometimes, to get to a balance point, you've got to kind of overshift, haven't you? So I think that shift towards slightly away from competition is probably no bad thing to get back to a more neutral position.
Yeah.
I think the interesting thing about mentioning a couple of Lionesses' parents as well is if you talk to parents of elite athletes across different sports, there will be all sorts of insights that you can take, and you can't follow them all, because there'll be, if you think about the sort of the Barrett parents, the All Blacks, they've got 3 sons who have played All Blacks. They've got a farm, and they've always not talked about rugby at home, and they haven't put the boys on a pedestal amongst all the other children because they've played for the All Blacks. So there's that example. Then you've got other examples where parents have invested everything in their children, and they talk about it all the time, and that athlete's being successful as well. So I think I always think it's really useful to listen and learn. I'm really curious about all the different journeys and all the different pieces of insight I hear, but you've equally got to work out what sits with you, don't you, and what feels right for you.
Absolutely. And you can't just copy and paste that approach worked for them and didn't for you. You speak to parents and you sort of say, oh, well, it worked for the Williams sisters and it worked for Tiger Woods. Yeah, but what about the millions that tried it as well and it didn't work for them?
Or even Roger Federer is a great, there's that great book Range, where they start the first chapter looking at the completely different approach of Tiger Woods and Roger Federer, and yet they both got to the greatest of all time effectively. Yeah, and
obviously recently, David Beckham's dad came in for everybody wanting to write articles across the world, but I sort of sat there and read all these and decided not to add my own commentary to it. But I was thinking about it afterwards. You look at what he went through and what he managed. There must have been elements of what his dad that did with him to help that set him up to get through that.
Yeah. Well, I think that probably touches on a more fundamental point, which is, especially at that higher end, sort of moving towards, elite's not a great term, but I'll use it for the sake of argument. Actually, what's the most important thing you can give your child, whether they're 12 or 18 or 25? Love and support, actually, and a space to go to. They've got someone to talk to. So we all try and do much more than that, I'm sure, and I'm as guilty of that as anyone else, sort of sending messages to my son about stuff that probably he just doesn't need to hear from me, and he probably ignores. But actually, that's what they need: that love, that support, that encouragement, and that sort of space, don't they, to feel really supported.
Yeah, but I'm sure when you sent them, it made you feel a lot better, though, Catherine.
Well, no, but that's the point. And I have to sometimes question myself exactly: am I sending this for me, or am I sending it's going to benefit the child I'm sending it to?
Well, and you know, and I think that comes up every week. I speak to a lot of parents who sort of say things, think they're being helpful either before a match or competition, and actually it's to make themselves feel better
about them, yeah,
because they're nervous and anxious, and it's not deliberate. It's just it's a natural thing. I remember one story from many years ago where, generally in sport, the same thing doesn't happen twice in a row. If you make a mistake of some kind, it's very unlikely that you're going to do the same the following Saturday and end up with the same outcome. It might happen, but it doesn't. And I think young people are brilliant because they play the game, they get over it. If it's gone wrong, following week, they start training again, they start moving forward and thinking about what's coming next. And I'll never forget where I let this play out for the whole week. And I think my son had forgotten all about it. He was ready to play again. And because I couldn't cope with the thought of it potentially happening again, what did I bring straight to the front of his mind the day before? Just remember last week, try to make sure that doesn't happen again. It's something that
which is the worst thing you could have said.
Couldn't have been any worse.
Yeah.
And I felt I'd done my bit to help, and actually, it was the worst thing I could have done. And I think this is where these conversations are so powerful because they're real, and you see how easy it is to
slip into the wrong thing. And I think there's a couple of points from there. I mean, one is I've only just been watching Ted Lasso, and it's just brilliant. I've been people telling me for the last couple of years, and we've finally got Apple TV. And this isn't an advert for Apple TV, I promise, but Ted Lasso is absolutely brilliant. And he has the concept of a goldfish, which I think is very effective. So, if you make a mistake or you have a bad day, you forget about it like goldfish do, and you turn up the next day with a fresh mind. And I think that's really important. And whether it's grassroots or elite level, we see the players who do really well have that ability to move on and shake off a mistake. So I think that's really important. There's a tension though there, I think, which is quite an interesting one, which is there is merit in being mindful of what went wrong, because obviously that's an opportunity to learn, right? So I think the tension is actually don't ignore it totally. Look back at the mistake, think about what happened, and then what you can do differently next time. Don't obsess about it, and certainly not the day before have your dad reminding you about it. But I think, that learning from. So it comes back to that same point being, and then this is probably one of my biggest learns, both through professional life, but also through being a sport parent, really being much more intentional and mindful of the language that I'm using, because you can take away very easily. And when I'm communicating, I want to add value, not take away. And that, I'm not always going to get it right. We're not always that thoughtful, but that's the sort of standard to which I hold myself to really try and get that right.
Yeah, I think language is key, isn't it? And I think appropriate language. And again, that probably changes at some points as well, depending on the age and stage that our children are at. Talking to a 7-year-old is going to be a very different dialogue to a 16-year-old.
Absolutely. And that's partly because your role is different. One of the coaches that I feature quite heavily in my book is Mel Marshall, who's Adam Peaty's coach, and she coaches sort of a number of other swimmers as well. She has a very good framework that she talks about, especially with Adam, but more generally, as he developed through and got older, as she's been coaching him, moving from forwards coaching to sideways coaching to backwards coaching. So forwards coaching, when Adam was young, you know, she needed to be ahead of him in the lead, really, really kind of leading him. As he grew and developed, it was more sitting side by side and a bit more collaborative. And now, you know, he's very experienced. Okay, he's obviously had some ups and downs, but effectively he knows his body, he knows what he needs to do. So her role is much more just sort of gently in the back. And I think that's also relevant for younger children at grassroots when we think about how we're communicating and how we're supporting them, whether as coaches, as parents, that actually we want to get to the stage where we are much less relevant and very much just kind of sitting in the background.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and obviously Mel's work with Adam's well documented, as I say, in your book. But actually, they've had a fascinating journey, like I think we all do with our own children, don't we? It is ultimately a journey.
Yeah, and I think again, you know, that's an interesting principle from that, which is that they know each other very well, and Mel deeply cares about Adam, and I think to really get the best out of someone, you've got to know them well, so you understand if they turn up one day what kind of mood they're in, and therefore how to interact with them, etc. And she really cares about him as a person as well as him as a swimmer. And I think bring it back to the parent, you know, it's a big advantage if you're coaching or supporting your child in their sporting endeavors. The fact that you do know them and you do understand them so well does give us a real advantage. It gives us that opportunity to really do it well. But there are so many things that also perhaps, you know, move us more to the not doing so well, like some of the things I've talked about being competitive, comparing your child with someone else's child who's developed much more quickly, and that kind of thing. So we've got advantages, but we've also got the emotive issues that come with being a parent that perhaps hinder us slightly as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just trying to make sense of what we're talking about. It's amazing. You could talk for hours and hours. Just moving this on a little bit. I mean, somebody once said to me, you know, Gordon, parenting is meant to be a selfless act. I've decided, along with thousands of sports parents, that there has to be something in it for us because we spend far too much time involved in it. What have been some of the best bits for you along the way?
Yeah, I think seeing my boys doing something they love, seeing them really develop through that as well. I think the friendships that I've made as a parent amongst the other parents, and the camaraderie and sort of feeling part of the community. So my husband and I have both got quite involved in sort of grassroots sports that the children have been playing, whether it's coaching or managing teams or whatever. So I think, you know, adding to your life in that way has been great. I think the knowing who's going to be there for you. So one of our sons was on a tour down, I think they'd been to Saracens, and then they were in St Albans, and neither my husband nor I were with him. He broke his ankle, had to get rushed to hospital, and you know, another set of parents basically looked after him till we could get there. You know, not a great situation to have been in, but really showed us who was there for our children and who was going to kind of care and support. So that was quite interesting. I think it's not about the winning, but we have had a few instances through the children's journeys that have just been magical. Our middle son captained the school team to Rosslyn Park winners at under 16 level. The school had never won before. You know, two joyous days at the highs and lows, but I will never forget standing next to the rugby master who'd been at the school for like 40 years, and he was crying, and, you know, so it does definitely brings you real joy, those highs. There's no doubt about it.
I mean, I was fortunate at Rosslyn Park. I coached 2 under-13 teams to win it, where you could still win it in different schools. And it was just without a doubt one of the highlights, and the emotion. And don't tell me winning isn't important to people, because it massively was to people who weren't even interested in rugby. Just the sheer connection that you know, you could go to a national event and win. And I always, it's very interesting. I find this a lot with football out in local communities, and some parents say that, you know, being quite good at it is actually a bit of a currency for us up here, which is another thing. They sort of say, actually, this gives our children opportunities that they wouldn't get.
Yeah, absolutely.
By being good at this. And, you know, we're saying, oh, well, no, it's not about, you know, this, and it's not about that. And actually for them, it is quite a big deal, because it opens a lot of doors.
Opportunities.
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously they're the best bits. and we all know, sadly, that we can't just always have the best bits. So, when do you think it's been the most challenging, or when have you really found it the most difficult being a parent, sports parent?
Well, I think between the three boys, I have sat through 7 operations under general anaesthetic that the boys have had to have. That is not easy as a parent, and it certainly hasn't been easy for the boys. The middle and younger in particular have had quite sort of long-term serious injuries. And I won't go into sort of too much detail, but that's hard as a parent because you really feel for them. They've been in pain, so they're coping with pain. They're coping with not being able to do stuff, even run around at playtime with their friends because they're in a cast or they're in a boot or they're in a sling or whatever, not being able to do the things they love, play the sports they want to while they're injured. From a wider perspective point of view, and I've always said this to the boys, it's only going to make them stronger. They'll have learned brilliant skill sets around how to cope with the disappointment, the pain, the missing out. They've each shown real discipline in kind of rehab, and so they've had an opportunity to learn that they're good at that and how to give themselves the best chance of doing that well. So it's brought lots of things, but quite frankly, as a parent, that is really hard to cope with. I've always felt very grateful I've had my husband alongside because we've been able to kind of go through that together. So I think, that's been hard. The odd not being picked for something. Again, as a parent, it's not about you, it's about them. But equally, that they're disappointed. So in other words, it's not about your disappointment, and it shouldn't be. But that they're disappointed, and so how you deal with them with that. But I think in order to have all the opportunities that the boys have done and the amount of sport that they've done, injuries are unfortunately inevitable. And as I said, while I wouldn't wish them on anyone, and I certainly wouldn't have wished them on the boys, there's so many positives to take from them as well.
Yeah, brilliant answer. Now, I'm hoping you're going to be the oracle on this for us all, with mine setting off in their teenage years. And I know lots of parents of sports parenting teenagers can be a tough challenge. What is your advice? Because obviously we talked about different ages. The teenage years present their own challenges. What advice can you give to all of us with kids at that stage?
Well, my boys are now 18, 20 and 22. And I'm sure if you sat them in front of you, they'd give you a whole load of series of things that I did wrong when they were in their teenage years. But I think probably the biggest thing for me is to cede control. You don't micromanage, accept that by ceding control to them, there might be some things which don't happen. They may not remember to turn up to training, or they might go out to a big party the night before a game or whatever. But if you don't give them that opportunity, I think, to take a bit more ownership and agency over their sport, whether it's grassroots still for fun or whether it's started to become a bit more serious, I think you're holding them back again in terms of the skill sets they need for going into a sporting life as an adult. So absolutely around ceding control, realizing that means that some things may not happen perfectly, but taking the longer, playing the longer game, taking the longer term view and keeping that perspective. Definitely didn't always get it right, but I tried to keep that principle in my head to try and play that as well as I could.
Yeah, and it's hard, isn't it? Because you're right, we want our children to have ownership. We want them to have a choice. We want them to take responsibility for things. I think the challenge then comes also as a parent is we've probably still got a role to point out the consequences for some of those choices, which we have to do anyway.
Yeah, but do you know what? Normally they'll realise them themselves, and there's nothing nicer than when they get there themselves and you have a conversation where they sit down and go, I'm not going to go to this 18th tonight because actually I know it's going to have an impact on tomorrow. And if they've got there, and I certainly didn't always get this right, okay, but if they've got there themselves and you hear one of your children saying that is just magical, and that will only set them up well. No matter what they go into in their future life, that's only going to set them up well.
Yeah, and that's that's the ultimate, isn't it? When we sit there and it's like, yeah, that's really well thought out. I'm really happy with that. But it's not because we've told them that's what should happen. They've worked it out themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think linked to that, we know it's not so much about what we say, it's about what we do, isn't it? And how we conduct ourselves. So I think so much of that, especially with teenagers as well, they're probably not going to listen. There's definitely a piece around picking your moments for when you've got the best chance of anything you want to say landing. I've had many times where I've gone in and they're watching telly and I've tried to talk to them, and afterwards I thought that was a complete waste of time because they weren't listening, they weren't going to take it in. I should have picked my moment better. So there's that element in terms of talking, but equally it's so much about what we do and how we conduct ourselves, I think, that gives them that example that they can just learn off day by day as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I want to talk a little bit about your book, Staying the Distance. In it, you highlight the lessons from sport that people have been missing, all aligned behind long-term sustained performance in the workplace. Obviously, we've got lots of sports parents, coaches, general, I guess, sport observers listening to this episode. What are some of the lessons and tips that we could apply into the context that we're talking about when you obviously researched and wrote your book?
Yeah, well, lots, fortunately, and I'll just try and pick out a few. But just on that broader point, I mean, yes, the book sort of ostensibly is aimed at lessons from sport that sort of people in business have been missing. But actually, certainly in the first half, it's much more general, and endorsers have included people like, excuse me, Baroness Sue Campbell, Stuart Lancaster, Dame Kelly Holmes, obviously Mel Marshall. So there's a huge amount here for people in the sports world, whether you're a coach or a sporting parent or a sporting leader, to take on board. And the first half is very much about how to get the best out of yourself over the long term. So I think the sort of things that I look at in that first half, how to leave behind fear. So there's quite a lot of research and insight and fresh stories in that chapter around the fact that fear can drive short-term performance. There's no doubt about it. And you listen to some athletes, you listen to some coaches, and there'll be that element of it's us against the world, or you're reacting against something, whether it's what someone said or the fact that you don't want to lose, or something that your fear of failure, fear of judgment. That the research shows that can be effective in the short term, but actually for long-term sustained performance, it's much better to leave that fear behind and actually focus on what it is that you're aiming for. There's one really good story in the book from Jeanette Kouakwe, who was a British sprinter, and I won't go into detail here, but really how she reframed the night before a big championship, her mindset from what she was moving away from, fear of not winning the race, to actually what she wanted to achieve, which was to break the British record and have that as the headlines in the paper the next day. That mindset shift absolutely changed the way she was able to perform and achieve the next day. So how to leave behind fear, how to leverage the power of emotions. So fear is obviously one emotion, but the chapter around emotions goes more broadly into emotions. Start with a story around Sir Chris Hoy, when he really was hijacked by his emotions, performed much more poorly than he was expected to in a particular race, realized from that he really had to solve and work on the mental side of his performance as well as the physical, took on a sports psychologist, and sort of around that story, there's quite a lot of research and insight that I share in that chapter around how to really leverage the power of your emotions rather than let them hijack and take away from your performance. Motivation. So there's a chapter on motivation, which I think is probably particularly relevant, looking at things like process that we've talked about, purpose, sort of why are you doing something, perspective, which again we've sort of touched on, but really understanding the importance of having a different perspective, and also other things in your life, particularly again as a young athlete, as a parent, making sure that it's not all about the sport, that you're helping your child to realize they're much more than that, and you appreciate and value them for much more than that. And so making sure there's that perspective. Probably the one that a lot of parents, in terms of your listeners, might want to focus on is the chapter called How to Bring the Required Discipline to the Table. The main point being here, we know that motivation wanes, it ebbs and flows. Actually, if you really want to give yourself the best chance of fulfilling your potential at something, you've got to put the work in, you've got to put the discipline in. It's very much what happens when no one's looking. And I refer to a piece of research which I think just has the best title ever, which is called The Mundanity of Excellence. And it's a research carried out by a chap called David Chambliss a number of years ago, but really looking at the sort of essentials, the basics, the mundane elements that go into really performing well, whether it's at your sport or anything else in your life, and how to make sure you can really give yourself the best chance of sticking to those.
It's well worth a read, the book. Catherine won't give it a shameless plug, but I certainly will. Catherine, we've covered a huge amount in such a short space of time. I guess my final question for you is your number one or your best bit of advice that you can possibly give to sports parents is ?
I'm going to do this in two ways. I'm going to give my advice and then explain. I'm going to reference a very good coach who helped me in coming up with this. So my number one tip is whenever you're going to communicate with your child about, their sport, whether it's on the way to, on the way back, whatever, I ask myself, what do they need from me in this situation? So that's my kind of killer question. What do they need from me in this situation? The context around it, I'm going to reference Danny Kerry. So some of your listeners may have heard of Danny Kerry, the most wonderful coach. So he coached GB women's hockey from, I think, 2007 right through to 2016 when they won gold in Rio. He went through a very well-documented and remarkable journey, really having to take on board lots of critical feedback after Beijing, where they only came sixth, and really transformed himself as a coach with a real growth mindset to try and be the best he could be for his players. And he has a couple of questions that he asks himself every day as he goes to coaching. Where am I and where do I need to be? To make sure that he's got the right head on, when he's going into the working environment. So my question is obviously a different one, but I got the idea from Danny, and I feature him quite a lot in my book. He's just wonderful. So that for me is, because it really helps me to remember it's not about me, it's about them.
Yeah, that's incredible. And those of you listening, Danny Kerry has been on the Parents in Sport podcast, so you can enjoy the episode with Danny. You can find that on the platform. Catherine, amazing advice. Thank you so much for giving up your time and joining us on the Parents in Sport podcast. I really hope that we will get the opportunity to chat again at some point in the future.
Yeah, my pleasure. I've really enjoyed our conversation, Gordon. Thank you. And I hope your listeners do too.
Thank you for listening. Check us out at parentsinsport.co.uk.